Hi everybody, welcome back to Capricorn TV live stream today. We are talking to today's author of Mystery of Serpent Mound. Get yourself a copy of this book. It is the most prolific book you're going to get on Serpent Mound, and Ross is a prolific researcher. I want to, there's a couple of questions more, I guess, on Serpent Mound, Ross, and I do want to get on to giants as well, and tall people, as you call them, which is, I think, a much more a politically correct name for them. But there's some strange biology going on at Serpent Mound. Has there, I mean, I think we talked about a pink frog before, and the fauna there is all sorts of weird and wonderful colours and stuff. Does anybody know why that is, Ross? Has anybody researched that from an academic point? Or do you know any people that have got involved in any research for that?
No, nobody's researched the anomalies. They've been touched upon, but the order of archaeology and anthropology here is still very conservative, and it's up to people like us to do the sort of esoteric studies. But the tall people, I think, are a subject of interest. Before we took the break, I was just briefly going over a history of when the last time we had a lot of tall people on the planet. That was during the Eugenic period, which was approximately between 7,000 years ago and 6,000 years ago. Now, when the phoenix rose, and many of you out there are familiar with the mythology of the phoenix, according to the Greeks and to the Arabians, once every 700 years approximately, the phoenix rises and will return, create a nest, and immolate itself. But this myth actually was started by the ancients, and the time period isn't 700 years, rather it's 7,000 years. And it's a great party that we have. And when it's over, it recedes back into the subconscious of humanity so that we will be unaware that it's about to come upon us again until just the last few minutes. And right now we're in those last few minutes, Susan. So a lot of us have been sent here to prepare the ground for the coming of the tall people. They are us. We are the tall people. But in order to explain where they came from and why Serpent Mountain has so many unusual features and such a strange history, we should go to Indian territory, American Indian territory, and discuss just for a couple of seconds concepts of mana and orenda. Were you going to say something, Jay?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, great that we bring in the Native American aspect there. That's a great point to touch on.
Yeah, I think it's been planned so that we can't ignore them. This is all really a beautiful, very highly planned event. Like I said, it only occurs once every 7,000 years, and at this time, the human species has basically shrunk, along with many animal species and flora, many trees and so forth, across the globe, to a size that if we got any smaller, we might damage our DNA. We weren't intended to be the size we are. And about 7,000 years ago, many people were, small as well. And during the course of the Phoenix Rising, which is a phenomenal event that occurs beneath the landscape of eastern North America and Canada, with Michigan being the head of the Phoenix, and the 7 powerful centers that go from Sault Ste. Marie down to Tallahassee, including Atlanta as the sexual center, Lansing, Michigan as the eye center, produces a country that for only a short space of 1,000 years goes from worst to first, and actually goes beyond our understanding into an exalted, paradisiacal Atlantean, in its essence, type of country. And then after the end of that 1,000 years, the elements that allow us to distill the magnetic field and convert it into etheric life force are removed from the pyramids, the temples, and the jewels that we use to help purify the atmosphere by spreading out the light, the transcendental light, are also removed. Now, the people in those days cultivated something called orenda, and they speak of it in their ancient scripture, especially from the Iroquois we get a lot of these, and from the Lenape people, and others. They discuss that from their ancestors, they understood that they lived to be much older and that they were tireless. They could run for days if they had to. Something like what you see in The Lord of the Rings when our three heroes are running after the goblins who have the two hobbits captive. They go on for days and days, and they're indefatigable. And Native people say their fathers were like that, but something happened, and they lost the ability, and they became decrepit and subject to disease. But within their memory, they could live to be 200 years old. They knew that for certain, but they were reluctant to draw the skeptic of white people, so they very rarely speak of it publicly. Nevertheless, the orenda was a spiritual force that they had within them, which had its originations in the food that they ate in those very ancient days. Now, the food that was grown in this part of the world when the phoenix was active utilized the magnetic field to enhance the nature of matter, whether it be stone, soil, air, water, to the point where everything had its own light. So naturally, things that grew to their full potential. All of the, what we call junk DNA, all of the vestigial aspects of people, animals, and plants grew to their full potential in those ancient days that we've lost memory of. And I don't want to sound like a preacher here, but you sort of get taken up by the spirit of it, because after a time, you realize there's a wonderful reality in our mythologies and in the oral traditions of our native peoples around the planet that we should pay more attention to. In any case, people eating these foodstuffs, eating the foodstuffs of paradise, developed to the point where they had no decay in their body. So instead of capping off their growth years at age 18 or 20, they continued to grow. And they continued to lose teeth and grow new ones. And so that by the time a man was 300 years old, 200 or 300 years old, he normally had attained the height of 7 feet. This is just normal for a man and many women. And then by the time he'd attained the age of, let's say, 400 to 500, he was 7.5 to 8 feet tall. And he just kept growing. And his youth didn't end until he was 800 or 900 years old. And then he became a mature man. And women became the embodiment of grace and beauty, such as the universe would like to pour its love through. So the women were goddesses, truly speaking, and they were of great stature, perfectly proportioned, and wherever they walked, things would grow and perfume would fill the air because of their relationship to the earth. They were perfected beings. And the men weren't that shabby either. They had the wisdom of the eternity going for them. And there was no war. And they were able to not only communicate with other planets, but to travel there very quickly, just in the twinkling of an eye, because when the ether is abundant, the amount of time it takes for light to pass from a star to us is shortened greatly. So when they enhanced the etheric membrane around the Earth, just between 7,000 and 6,000 years ago, they were able to welcome visitors from the planets in our own solar system, and they were able to trade with people from other stars and exchange information. But as soon as the ethereal protection was removed, then we lost direct connection with other planets and, frankly, other people that live on this sphere that have stayed in the higher dimensions of it. But to this day, we still see people traveling in their ethereally driven vehicles for moments, because there's a lot of traffic up there. We just generally don't see it because our eyesight isn't purified enough. It isn't composed of, our bodies aren't composed of foodstuffs such as they had. So where the giants came from is just pretty much easy to understand from that point. 6,000 years ago, the elders that had perfected themselves retired into the Atlantean world and the Lemurian world. And their sons and daughters, the sons of the gods, decided they were going to make it happen. But they lacked the grace because they lacked the temple systems backing them up. So their forebears had given away items in trade just to prove the goodwill and the superabundance and the love of Manitoba, which is the name of the country that we live in here. Great Manitoba, Gitche Manitoba. But when the sons and daughters of the gods took over, these mighty men, they couldn't provide things without accepting exchanges. And so trade routes began to be opened to Greece and Egypt, and the copper trade began to be opened. Where once the phoenix and its crown plume shone with the brilliance of copper illuminated with the ethereal element, now it was all hardened back to solid copper, and they were mining it and selling it to the people across the oceans to use in their technologies. After 300 years, so we're going back to 5,800 or so, 5,700 years ago, the height of the people in America had diminished to 9 feet from being on the average of 10 feet. And then bad relations broke out, and wars happened, and within 1,000 years, the phoenix, which had once so brilliantly illuminated the landscape of eastern North America and Canada and the world by proxy, had completely folded its wings and immolated itself by creating another nest, which is represented as the many ancient temple sites surrounding the serpent, and he became a worm. At that point, they recreated it to match the constellation Draconis as it was 5,000 years ago. So you have the phoenix rising for 1,000, folding its wings for 1,000, and that imprint was laid into the design of the serpent, which is how I was able to date it, star mounts, and in the mystery of the Serpent Mount to about 3,000 BCE, 5,000 years ago. At that time, the sons of God, so to speak, were beginning to understand their mortality, because their orenda, which was the sacred essence which powered the vital force of their bodies and inhabited their, what we call kundalini today, and at one time left their inner eye open to see the light of the one God and to hear the music of the cosmos. They became blind and deaf to these things, and they sought gold, and they sought women. And the rest was just a story that was sadly told, because they did procreate with other societies, especially in the East and Near East, throughout Europe. And therefore there were royal houses that all had giant lineages. which is how they're remembered, of course, in the Bible and in other traditions. But very quickly, the big men were put on the front lines on the wars in those ancient times, before the Old Testament, during the time of the Old Testament of the Bible. And very quickly, that DNA was made unavailable, so the giants began to die out. And in North America, however, they still believed in the traditions of their forebears, even though they had paid the price. And they did something remarkable. The Cherokee today still say that the original man and woman, Adam and Eve, came from their country a very long time ago, and that they would return one day. And so there was a system of intermarriage instituted among the native people of the Americas that allowed them to marry other people of the very tall stature, and in that way they were able to maintain the genetics of the very tall and commanding physique. And in some instances, they also had a very potent orenda as well, a very potent spiritual force, which allowed them to communicate with people, tapping into the executive powers that their forebears had. And they remembered those days, and they remembered the stories, so that just 3,000 years ago, when the Adena people came here, they fought a war with the remaining giants, defeated them, but both sides were so messed up that they had to inbreed with each other, and therefore the archaeological Adena had many men and women of very tall stature, on average about 7 feet. There were a lot of 6-footers, but the average person was only, a woman was 5'1", and the men were about 5'6". So there was an elite core of people among the Adena who inherited their genetics from the Allegheny people, or Allegheny people, that allowed them to continue the tradition of giant stature. And that continued right until the time of the coming of the Europeans, when apparently so much inbreeding over such a long period of time, thousands of years, may have arrested the development of their immune system, making them unable to deal with smallpox.
One of the things that I guess just comes into my mind is thinking about, these tall beings, and also people that have had, call it, extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional encounters. Typically, the more benevolent the being, the taller they seem to be. And I know that I don't believe there's any research on this as of yet, so it's, kind of, some anecdotal information, but it's one of the things to me when people talk about, seeing, quote unquote, these ascended masters or these beings that have this tremendous wisdom, and they're coming back and interacting with people, that are in this plane of existence, to go back to stewarding the earth, to go back to, being the keepers of the garden, to activate that piece. So that's just one of the things that comes into mind from that relationship.
Lovely. Well said. What do you think of that, James?
I think that's a very astute perspective. That's what I think. I want to talk about the historical accounts, Ross. How far back do these historical accounts go? Why don't we have bones to look at in museums today? I know there's a number of factors for that. Maybe we can talk about some of them. People obviously want to say, where's the bones for all these tall beings?
Well, I can give you 6 or 7 good reasons why the bones don't exist anymore. Most anthropologists don't have the patience to listen to those reasons. But in fact, racial prejudice aggravated by greed, or greed aggravated by racial prejudice, is the main cause for the loss of the majority of Indian artifacts. Millions of people lived and died on this continent, and in the last 5,000 years, hundreds of thousands of them were consigned to burial crypts, tombs, cemeteries, mounds, various other sepulchres that were never violated by the native cultures, even when another culture may have come in of an indigenous type, they wouldn't dig into the mounds or the graves of their forebears or their enemies' forebears. And so that tradition of keeping the sanctity of the land was preserved. But Christian men didn't have that philosophy. They carried it with them from battles going back from before the time of David, from especially memorable, I think, are the times of Alexander, when Alexander conquered the entire known world. Then he situated himself in Alexandria and started a library, and there he felt, because he had created this wonderful dome of protection, that he could safely store all the information from all the ancient sources in the library there. And then he was murdered, right? That sort of told you something. Then his wife, his sweet wife, was hunted down and murdered along with their only child. And these acts resulted in the sacking of the library at Alexandria by a Christian mob in later times. I mean, you may not see the connection, but it all has to do with jealousy, greed, thirst for power, and racial prejudice. Political and racial prejudice hit this country, the United States now, with the fury of a hellish hurricane. And not only do the native people find themselves unable to respond with guns and military might, but they couldn't survive the diseases that some of the first Spanish left here, De Soto and those people. And it wasn't long before the native people found themselves conquered by default. It just was something that they had never intended, but they had anticipated in their hearts, because the wise among them said that the time is coming when a great white bird will come and sit and nest in this country. So, as their prophecies came true before their eyes, they recognized the fact that their culture had to be preserved in some way, because as every treaty was violated, every one, and every piece of land was taken, the farmers and the townspeople who owned those original 600-acre plots given away by Washington and Jefferson because they couldn't pay the Revolutionary War vets, said, we'll scare the Indians out of Ohio for you and Kentucky, and you can just go in there and squat on their lands. We'll make sure they don't scalp you. Well, they didn't do that. A lot of whites did die, and I'm glad in a way that they had to go through a struggle, because it made them a little more conscience worthy for what they found. And what they found was an astonishing number of earthworks, mainly burial mounds, that contained in them the artifacts and the treasures of a civilization that was, through its own loss of Arenda, its own loss of the spiritual life, been struggling to maintain for thousands of years. So, in spite of all the prayers put out by Indians, and in spite of white people with conscience, virtually every mound was dug into. And what they found in these mounds astonished them to the point where they had to pull out their Bibles to be sure that they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. And that was, and picture yourself as a European settler coming in and getting your 600-acre plot and noticing that on your property there were 2 or 3 mounds, knowing that in Ohio there was a minimum of 10,000 mounds. So virtually every county had them. And so they would plow their fields, and then in the afternoons of Sunday and in the evenings, if they still had any energy, they would dig into the mounds, thinking they owned them, and see what they could find. They found skeletons of men and women of gigantic stature, almost frightening. And they immediately recorded these things, at least the ones that were literate. So fortunately, because of old newspaper accounts and old diaries that we were able to lay our hands on, township records and so forth, we found over the years over 1,000 accounts, easily over 1,000 accounts, of the recovery of bones that were minimally 7 feet. When we began to publish these accounts back in 1999, we made the unfortunate mistake of putting them online. And at the time, the internet wasn't that well known to everybody, but people who were savvy internet users just cherry-picked our articles. And we've been working with Native American people to get the pictures correct so that it wouldn't be misunderstood. And unfortunately, the same thing happened then as what, to answer your question, James, as what happened to the people's corpses. Our accounts of these skeletons being disinterred were immediately compounded with the Nephilim and the giants. And so there's these invasion events must have happened from the East over to America, and they inbred with the native people. And pretty soon, what we were attempting to construct was destroyed by certain authors, and who shall remain nameless. But nevertheless, because of Hugh Newman and Jim Vieira and others like Micah, we've been able to put a little more power behind the original concept, kind of stress down the understanding of we can do whatever we want with these bones and also the accounts of these bones, and settle into what really happened, what really was going on. Why were there so many people of incredible stature? This sets Darwinian theory on its ear, and it did. And so even though these were reported by the Smithsonian, their field crews, and logged into their annual reports, the Carnegie Museum in the 1950s, and of course the University of Kentucky back in the 1930s and 40s did a lot of work finding these skeletons. The anthropologists of today don't read them, they disregard them, they push them out of the way, and they say to us, who are making every honest effort to bring to the light of fact and truth, if you will, these incidents, that we're misleading people and the giants never existed.
Sounds like it's time to get some new anthropologists trained and more holistic in their thinking, so we can actually get a better understanding of our past to understand where we're going in the future and how we want to craft that.
Yeah, I was just saying, Ross, that perhaps the academic standpoint, they'd like to keep the ethnic cleansing, that the infrastructure in place, and this moment of stasis that they're in, where they don't want to look at these articles of giants, nor do they want to look for the bones that are stocked in the museums or miscategorized. They just want to just keep that ethnic cleansing that happened in its history where it's at, and brush it all under the carpet, keep it all nice and sterile.
Well, there are those that have the opinion, but there's many more people that are interested in the professional ranks to know if there's some validity to this. What we think happened was that because in the very early 20th century, around 1910, the Smithsonian brought on board a relatively notorious figure, a physician who did work in anthropology, named Les Hrdlička. And this guy was a member of the Eugenics Society. These are the people that believe that Negroes were one step below us or two steps, and that Indian people were one step below us, evolutionary-wise, and so forth. Now, I don't want to do a disservice to a former employee of the National Museum, but my God, the man was just awful. Even his colleagues in those days were afraid of him, because it was his intention to literally annihilate the concept of any Native American who was taller than we are, and also that no Native American could have even lived here before the dates that he ascribed to the Garden of Eden, or the late Garden of Eden, because there weren't any people anywhere. So he was very much a pre-Nazi kind of figure. And in fact, after his tenure and during the latter part of his life, fascism took over in Germany, as we well know. But he was part of that American version of fascism that had a growing response among the white middle-class average Joe, and of course the other men who were in political positions to maintain sort of a hold over the politics of the country, to just keep things as they were, keep the status quo. The Ku Klux Klan, they're okay as long as they stay down south, but we're not going to really get on them about keeping black people in place. And it is the same thing about Native people. We don't want, through the admission of these skeletons into a legitimate laboratory, to have them studied to the point where they can be determined to have had a superior brain capacity to ours. And of course, many of them seem to. They had beautifully fashioned skulls. They had very strong jaws. They had large orbits for the eyes. And in fact, they had some aspects to their bone structure which don't even exist in Homo sapiens sapiens. Like there were these subtle attachments to the long bones for muscles that grew right out of the bone. So they would have less of a chance of losing rubber band-like their muscle from detaching from the bone. They had these safeguards. They were like little, knobs. And they had also, in some cases, the capacity to likely exert themselves far and away beyond what our best Olympic athletes could have done, because their bodies seemed to be perfect. They didn't seem to have any flaws in them, proportion-wise, bone-wise. Their teeth were oftentimes one of the best parts that had preserved themselves. In some cases, the flesh was still evident, and you could make out what they looked like in life. Just beautiful people, very handsome men, and just beautiful, lovely women. And in fact, some of them still live among the Osage to this day. And when Jefferson heard about the Osage, he invited them because to come to Washington. He invited them because he was getting a lot of flack from the Europeans saying that everything on the American side of the Atlantic is small. Everything on the European side is big. And what do you got to say for yourself about that? This is the Comte de Buffon, another notorious figure in ancient biology of Europe. And Jefferson was just overjoyed when he was able to receive these people. And some of the gentry in Washington described them as being nature's own nobility. They walked with such style and a commanding appearance that it was as though they were truly the elect of nature herself. And I think you can imagine the dignity and the grace that people that stand over 7 feet in height can carry with them. And of course, their race goes back thousands of years. And from what I understand, to be a race of godlike beings. So their efforts at intermarriage, that was such great success that they were witnessed even by the Jeffersonian Society.
Wow. The double rows of teeth and the size of the bones and the number of the accounts, Ross, in the record should beg some sort of research from either Smithsonian and co. But they just dismissed them. I don't know how you can dismiss such overwhelming evidence. They clearly 100 years ago the accounts were well documented by sometimes credible sources as well. They weren't just a couple of random. The number and the type of people that were reporting this. Maybe give us one or two examples if you can.
Examples of why the bones are missing?
Yeah, well, examples of the credibility of people reporting them and sizes or places or.
Yeah, they're perfectly credible people. I mean, the late 19th century didn't have any archaeologists, no trained archaeologists yet. That came a little later. But nevertheless, there were men out there who were physical physicians and people who had an interest in the mortuary sciences. And they were able to measure correctly in the grave. And they recorded it duly. And we have a number of accounts where people were measured in the grave. But nowadays, the anthropologists say, no, the skeletons disarticulate in the grave, and they spread out, and it makes it look like they were bigger. And those men were all mistaken. This is the line of the Smithsonian nowadays. They were all mistaken measures of anthropometry. It's a fancy word for measuring people. And that excuse is really absurd. But when you have somebody in authority using their influence to come out like that, a lot of people say, oh, he's the authority, you must believe him. But it's going to keep coming back on him because from the way these men conducted themselves and from the sheer number of accounts, we know that they measured accurately and in the grave. Now, the real problem about these bones that were uncovered and shipped off to various museums, and a lot of them the National Museum was able to pull together because they were asking for them. You know, they were saying, if you find anything unusual, any anomalies, send them to the National Museum. So, you know, we have a number of accounts saying, well, we found this 8-foot giant in a cave in the Adirondacks, and so we're going to ship it off to the Smithsonian. You know, Dr. So-and-so is making the arrangements right now. And then they get to the Smithsonian, and Dr. Hertlichka or whoever says, no, they were mistaken. That wasn't really a giant. It was just some sort of a freak, or we never received the bones, things like that. And one after another, these bones became lost. So there is a working theory that they're all in the Chesapeake Bay. They were pulverized and summarily shipped out because it's directly adjacent to the Smithsonian. So we think there was a second genocide that occurred, and that was the genocide of their ancestors.
Hiding the evidence.
Yeah. How do the Native American people feel today? I believe they want this. They opted for the repatronization of the bones or whatever was left. Tell us about the repatronization, because this is an important angle, and it's ceasing any more digging of any monuments.
Yes, I talked to a Native man at a Native American conference that I attended a number of years ago in Nisqually, Washington, and the elder was with the Nez Perce Indians. And he said he witnessed the burial of gigantic skeletons that had been recovered from various museums, the National Museum, but that nobody spoke of them, and they were just reinterred in secret places actually. So the National Museum nowadays may be more interested in the truth of this whole matter, but these heinous acts were committed by their predecessors over a century ago in many cases. But when you go back to more than a century ago, you have honest and matter-of-fact agents of the Smithsonian accounting the truth. So there was a period there between 1910 and 1940 when the evidence seems to have just vanished. There was a lot of disinterments performed in the late 1800s by the Smithsonian. A lot of them, hundreds of sites, important sites, were just destroyed and left to the erosions of weather after they plucked away all of the anomalies and artifacts and other relics. So there was a period of finds when everybody was enthusiastic and there was a lot of controversy, and then suddenly a dark force seems to have come and embodied itself as the final word of all archaeology and anthropology in the entire country. Mind you, the giants in Europe and the rest of the world, for the most part, were already long gone. Their graves have been dug up. We have many accounts of those.
Mm-hmm.
And their bones were taken. You know, when you find a giant skeleton, what's the first thing you do? Okay, it's on your property. You're only 16 years old, so you're not mature yet. And you think, I wonder if we can sell this giant skull. Yeah, I know Dr. So-and-so would probably pay a lot for it. Okay, well, what if he thinks what if he wants the rest of it? Well, let's take the long bones too. So they take the bones from the legs and the arms and just the identifying bones that you can tell that the individual is very tall. And they take it to the physician. And sometimes the physician will say, can you get me the rest of it? And they'll say, yeah. So he'll put it together, he'll articulate the skeleton, and then he'll make a little display for it in his home or his office. And it'll be on display for several years maybe. But then eventually he'll die, and his wife will say, I don't know what I want to do with the bones. Do you want them? Because by that time, everybody will have seen them and thought it was just normal. And that's one way in which the bones disappear. Another way is that when they were originally dug up, we have many accounts talking about this, they had accumulated so much rain moisture and dried and rain, but it had yet been hermetically sealed that when they were revealed to the air, the oxygen in the air began to seep into the porous nature of the bones. And they became very brittle and turned to dust in a matter of days. Sometimes hours, they were all black. So that was an unfortunate circumstance. But in many cases, the bones were hard and easy to disinter. And the Smithsonian made every effort to do that. In some cases, the native people had intentionally placed the corpse in like a clay. And so the actual outline of the corpse was perfectly preserved as well as the length. So they were able to measure it accurately. But sometimes the bones would deteriorate.
Sure.
There's other reasons, but mainly I think people removing the skeletons and then taking them to places where they were disarticulated and scattered about, sold to various people, and then just lost and regenerated. That's the real culprit.
Ross, take a moment there and give people out the names of your books and where people can get a hold of them. I'm not sure you have a website, Ross, but you are active on Facebook too.
Yeah. My Facebook site is Ross Hamilton, R-O-S-S Hamilton, like in Alexander Hamilton. And I have the icon of the Serpent Mound in winter. There's a lot of Ross Hamiltons out there, as you might expect. But I have the icon in winter of the serpent The other book that I'd like people to look at, and I'll try to put it up to the camera. I don't know if you can see it or not.
Star Mounds.
Star Mounds.
Wow.
Star Mounds, Legacy of a Native American Mystery. And this is the one where I show
Wonderful.
how the many constellations of the night sky were embodied as temple structures and the temple foundations surrounding the serpent, so that the serpent, being at the center of the night sky in the constellation Draconis, had all of these beautiful celestial houses theoretically rotating about it in those very ancient days when the garden was here. Just for a moment, the Star Mounds contains a lot of stories. A lot of them are reconstructed. Some of them are straight out of the mouths of Indian speakers. But the purpose of the book is to show that the serpent served as a sort of axis mundi, which is the pillar that runs between the underworld, the middle world, and the upper world, that keeps everything together and rotating and moving together, much like the tree of life for Asgard, or the Kabbalistic tree that embodies all of the levels of the cosmos. So the Native American people here, their ancestors, their godlike, if you will, ancestors, created a system, a cosmography, that was so sophisticated that when all was said and done, in the beginning, when the phoenix first rose 7,000 years ago, every one of those lodges had a shard of the gemstone that the serpent contained at its head. The Cherokee refer to this gem as the Ulanya Sut. And, they refer to it as the Ulanya Suti, which I believe were the shards of the mother stone, which was at the axis mundi of the serpent. And they describe in their old stories how when those lamps were still working, they put out a very powerful spiritual light. And with a little research, we were able to put together that spiritual light was able to cast into dissolution the grip that the world of gross physical matter has upon the senses, and illuminate the ethereal world and show how it is integrated to the physical world. And therefore, at these ancient sacred sites that had the mother stones or the shards lit up on their manitous, their spirit animal likenesses, they were able to actually pierce the veil and move into what they call the good lands or the happy hunting grounds. Of course, in Great Britain, you have Tir na Nog of the Irish, and you have various other realms of Avalon that you can, if you can pierce the veil, you can get back to. In China, it's the Jade Gardens. And for the Greeks, it was the Elysian Fields. These are places that exist now, in the present, but with the spiritual technology that was operated in those days, they were able to make going into the happy hunting grounds and hunting, if they wished, hunting for herbs, if you want, the possibility for the citizens.
Wow. Well, I'm going to wrap things up at that, Ross. And Susan, you have any final comments for Ross?
Well, I know that we're limited on time. I was hoping that Ross could say maybe just a little bit about something like the Ark of the Covenant being used as like a jumpstart to, shift the energetics that are around the planet to, have more of that opening. We just talked about piercing the veil, right? That there was, groups of people that were able to do this before, but here we stand at a pretty unique point in time. And I just want to take a minute to say this. There does seem to be quite a bit of darkness that's here on the planet, and you oftentimes hear people say, well, there needs to be darkness in order to have the light, but it does seem like we are predominantly in more darkness than we really are light, that we've really just forgotten what light looks like, feels like, is embodied. And, I was just wondering if you can take just a couple of moments to maybe comment on that, because, I think as we know, the spiritual aspect is so important, and there is an interplay of the technology, yet it does seem that technology cannot jump before the spirituality, that there really needs to be a beautiful marriage, and I just would love your insight on that, Ross.
Well, a couple of quick things, because I know James would like to wrap this up. The Ark of the Covenant is a tool that's used to restart these paradises. It was commonly used to operate the Manitous and the ancient temple systems. There's more than one Ark of the Covenant. At this time, it's karmically restricted. Nobody can put one together at this time, even if they try. And if they try, they might hurt themselves. But it basically, when you seal up material, like just common limestone, for example, or silica, within an ark, it tends to create a soup out of it and release this naturally occurring electrical matrix, which subsequently is harmonized and reharmonized within the interior of the ark to become a highly polarized form of current, very positive electrical energy that can be used to invoke the clouds and bring down the negative energy of the sky. And it's the consummation of the energy from the ark and the energy from the sky that gives us the refurbishment of the ethereal body of the earth, so that we're able to interface with the higher world again. So that's the covenant we have with the Creator. And secondly, and I just slipped my mind, what was that real quick? The second part of your question, dear?
Well, I was just talking about the interplay of the consciousness and the technology, that one can't really perceive. Well, the technology can't really perceive the consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah. The light is unknown to most people. A good way to see the light temporarily, and I hope the masters will bless this instruction, is to on a nice day, somewhere where you have time, just look up at a cloud or look at a tree in the sunlight or the moonlight, but don't let the sun get in your eyes. Just look at a tree, and without anybody interfering with you, stare without blinking your eyes at one point on the tree. Try not to move your eyes very much, but do not blink them. And if you're lucky, after a while, you'll be tested. You'll want to blink, and you're not allowed to hold them open forcefully, just with your consciousness. A flood of ethereal light will pour in. It'll be like just brilliance. You'll see it. And if you can keep your eyes open and drink in that light, you can get a glimpse of the fairy people or whoever or whatever is living in that area where you are. But take those instructions with a grain of salt, too. It's not easy to do that. It's a type of samadhi.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
Thank you.
Wow, Ross, it's always great to talk to you, and great to see you again as well, and great to have you on for Capricorn TV. It's an absolute pleasure talking to you today, Ross. Really is. I really enjoyed it. I really did, and you're going to talk to us in the not too distant future, I hope.
I hope so, too. It's lovely meeting you, Susan, and it's great being with you.